day, but hello. So you're giving a lecture for this? Okay, that is for you. Just so everyone can hear you.
Okay, now. Okay. Hi, everybody. So it looks like I get 7 minutes, and I'm excited to be here. I'm a UCLA alumnus, so it's a homecoming of sorts. I'm glad to be here. So what am I talking about? Well, I actually wrote a chapter for a book called Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astral Blackness. It was, the title of it was Playing a Minority Forecaster in Search of Afrofuturism, Where Am I in This Future, Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand is a marvelous guy. He wrote the Whole Earth, edited the Whole Earth catalog, and also founded the Long Now Foundation. I'm a research affiliate with the Institute for the Future. I studied them for my dissertation and was really interested in how what they do is they create future scenarios for Fortune 500 companies, major corporations, and nonprofit agencies and government agencies. When I arrived there in 1998, what I noticed was the future was white. and it didn't really have a lot of me in it or my experiences. And so, but they do have a really good methodology that I have adopted, from insight to foresight to action. And that's going to be the spiel that I'm going to give to you right now. So the insights. Well, in Afrofuturism, the way I see Afrofuturism too is sort of telling the story of how we were transported from West Africa, our home planet, as the Black diaspora, to an alien world. And when we got to this world, we were killed if we spoke our language, practiced our rituals. And so what we learned to do was, under the radar of Christianity, a religion imposed upon us, we created what's called sonic utopias, spirituals, that talk about a day when we'll be uncolonized and free. And so what that leads to is looking at how do we democratize the future. And so what my insights have been on that is through gaming. And what's interesting about gaming is that gaming actually addresses the parts of our minds in terms of creating alternative memories of the future. Now let me back up a bit and give you some context about that. So Afrofuturism was a traumatic middle passage, right? And so through these sonic utopias and spirituals, we survived generations of oppression. And so there's the parts of our brain in neuroscience that the same spots where we think about memory is also the same areas where we think about the future. And in order to heal trauma, we want to try to create alternative memories of the future. And so what we have been trying to do is create games to do this. And one of the games that we created was called Afro Rhythms from the Future. So how do we imagine radical speculative futures? Well, we took a forecasting game that's already in existence. You may have heard of it or may not have. It's called The Thing from the Future. And we did, what we do at Cal State East Bay, the place where I teach and do research, is we have game jams. And in these game jams, we've created alternative visions of the future. So we did an experimental game jam where we took this game by Stuart Candy called The Thing from the Future, and we hacked it up with our students. And so what we noticed was, now Stuart Candy is a great guy and fantastic, brilliant person. You should look him up. But he comes from Australia, so it's a different cultural context. And what we noticed is in this game that he created, there's a arc card that looks at different times in the future and different scenarios of collapse, transformation, growth, and constraint. And then there's another card called a mood card, because there's going to be an emotion in the future. What is the emotion going to be like in the future? Is it going to be optimistic, tragic, sad, or what? And there's a terrain card, a context of the future. Is it going to be about communication, gender, childhood? So terrain, a mood card, and an object card, because it's the thing from the future. So what will this object be? Will it be, like, what does a postcard look like in 2030 around childhood? and that's optimistic. So we gave this, and we gave this game to our students to play. And it was predominantly female players. It was a small group of experimental group that we played with. And when it came to the mood card, they were like, well, Beyonce's a mood. Kanye's a mood, you know? Beyonce's unapologetically black and female enshrined power, right? Kanye's just crazy. So, you know, and then they were like, Netflix is a mood, definitely, right? And so they were just, you know, and so I was like, wow, yeah, you're right. That was better than I could have come up with. And then they were like, in the terrains, they noticed, well, where's immigration? Where's LGBTQ and queer people? That wasn't there. One of my students actually said, well, where's the handbag?
Lonnie, you have 1 minute.
1 minute. So what I want to say is that we came up with this game called Afro Rhythms from the Future. And what we're trying to guard against are encoded judgments that are coming into the fray with embedding pre-existing biases into artificial intelligence and machines. What we want to do with this game is have it be a generation engine where we are creating new futures that imagine tensions of the future from an Afrocentric perspective. So we're trying to put more African soul into artificial intelligence. And through our game, Afro Rhythms from the Future, we want to actually shape the AI of the future to be something that has more African and embodiment in it. Another game that I'm creating as well, and I co-created this game with Eli Kosminski and also Ahmed Best, and the Fathomers are involved, so we got the whole gang in it. So it's really a cool game. Let me just circulate a card. One of the cards is Black Superheroes, so I'll just circulate that for a minute. So the idea
Lonnie,
is... Yes.
your time is up.
Oh my God.
Andrew, please take Lonnie to the next room.
Democratize the future.
You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Wow. All right. Thanks. Oh, I have to go. Oh. Jeez. Well, I'm taking my water with me. No, you guys are great. Thank you.
Okay, tell me. Okay. Okay.
Maynard, you have 7 minutes.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Maynard Holliday, and glad to be here. This is my third speed dating event with these guys, but I am a senior engineer at the RAND Corporation, but I work up in the Bay Area, and before that, I worked for President Obama at the Pentagon, so I'm rocking my presidential pin with his engraved signature on the back, and my 44 cufflinks, that all us appointees got. So what I did for him was technology horizon scanning for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, so that we can maintain our technological superiority to deter aggression. And so I looked at technologies across the board. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is artificial intelligence. I sat on the Defense Science Board where we looked at autonomy and as it applied to military issues and operations. And the conclusion we came to was we can't afford not to pursue it because our adversaries are not beholden with the same value sets and constraints we have. And so at the very least, we need to be able to react at machine speed if we are attacked with AI-enabled systems. And so, so we thought we had a pretty good case, and when we brought this to the attention of the combatant commanders after we did all of our research and wrote the report, they said, this is very compelling, but we are never going to use this unless you can tell us what it's doing, why it's doing it, and whether it's able to carry out what is known as commander's intent. And so that took us aback, but we understood, and the civilian analog is our reticence now to get into an autonomous vehicle, turn on autopilot. We're not there yet. And so the question becomes, how do you trust, what do you need to do to trust an AI system? And so one of the things I'm looking at RAND is, what's essentially an algorithmic bill of rights? What necessary things are required for us to trust AI systems? And so experts have opined on this and have come to some consensus, and we're at various stages of adoption of this. And so in the Department of Defense space and also the civilian space, you can bin AI into what we call tool AI, which is Alexa, Siri, that doesn't have high consequence for mistake. You're asking it a question and it gives you a wrong answer. It's not affecting your life in a big way. But then there's high stakes AI, and so that's both what we call kinetic and at rest. And the kinetic is the AI that's running autopilot in your Tesla, or running cruise control, adaptive cruise control. And then there's the AI at rest, which is determining whether you get a mortgage or what your insurance rates are, or whether you get a job or not when you press that button on LinkedIn and your application goes in and the AI is reading it. It's checking out your schools, checking out how long you've been in the workforce, and making a determination before a human ever sees it. And then on the criminal justice side, an AI is determining parole and whether your sentence length, and then AI is now at international borders and determining whether people get asylum. So they're entering data, about your country of origin and looking at keywords and sentence strings to determine whether you're eligible for asylum. And so there are tenets that are out there, starting with transparency, that you should be able to know if you're dealing with an AI. Consent, you should be able to consent to having your personal information or whatever you're working with dealt with by an AI. Explainability, you should be able to be explained to you so that you understand it. You should have redress. So if an AI gives you an adverse outcome, you should be able to appeal that and understand what was basing its decision on. There should also be a right to education. You should be able to be educated about how these systems work so that you're more informed. You should also have portability. You should, meaning you should be able to take your data and move it from system to system, as you do now with your data on your phones. Then there's freedom from bias. You should be able to have AI deal with your information in an unbiased way, and it should be able to be proved to you. Then there's, I already said consent. Portability.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, and lastly, governance. Federal and international law should be in place to be able to govern, as I said, the AI that's at these national borders that are determining whether people get asylum, get in, to a country, and so forth. So I'm going to stop there. So I'll see you at the Q&A.
like use some humor. All right. I've got visual aids, which you're not going to be able to see from back there, but you should have sat closer to the front. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started so that we can have like 12 seconds longer than we're supposed to have. And then here you go. So my name is Tracy Drain, and I'm an engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And currently, I'm working on a really cool mission that's gonna go and visit one of the most unique asteroids in our solar system. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the asteroid belt, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about this super cool asteroid we're gonna go visit, and then a little bit about the mission. And if we're lucky, I'll save you 12 and a half seconds for one question at the end. So this picture that those of you back there cannot see is a picture of the asteroid belt. So the main asteroid belt is between Mars and Jupiter, and it's where lots and lots and lots of asteroids live. We know that there are about 840,189 asteroids out there. There's an estimate that there's probably between 1 and 2 million asteroids that are larger than 1 kilometer. And that may sound like a lot, and when you look at this picture, it looks like it's super densely populated, right? But the thing about that is, the largest asteroid we know of, which is Ceres, the first one discovered, is about 1,000 kilometers across, and that's like between here and Salt Lake City, Utah, right? That single asteroid has about 1/4 of all the mass of the entire asteroid belt. And if you took all the asteroids in the asteroid belt and jammed them all together, you would get a mass that's like 4% of the moon. And so when you look at a picture like this, you're like, well, why does it look like that? It's really just to give you a sense of how many asteroids are out there.
Tracy, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yay! Okay. But really, they're really far apart. On average, every single asteroid is about 1 million kilometers away from another asteroid, which is about 25 times the circumference of the Earth. And I used to be really annoyed when I saw movies and they showed like spaceships that were like going through the asteroid belt and like trying to avoid us. But I totally get it, artistic license, okay. And you totally wouldn't get that you were going through an asteroid belt if you were looking at a screen and you saw like a whole lot of nothing, which is what actually happens when you fly. So, next picture is an artist's concept, because we don't actually know what this looks like, of the asteroid called Psyche. You know about Psyche? Yes, yeah, I would like give you a handshake. So Psyche is super cool. It was discovered in 1852, and I love that it's called Psyche, which is Greek for the soul. It was named after Psyche, the mythological figure who married Eros, and then Aphrodite is really mad at her for reasons, if you go and read the story. But then Zeus took pity on her and made her immortal so she can marry him and be there forever. So it's called the soul, and they did not even know why that's a really cool name for this asteroid. Because now, when we study it from the Earth, we can tell certain things, like kind of roughly how big it is. If it were perfectly spherical, which it's not, but if it was, it's like 226 kilometers across, which is about from here to San Diego. And based on certain measurements scientists can take, they can tell that it is probably mostly made of metal, like maybe 90% nickel iron metal, which is super cool. And the scientists are trying to figure out, A, is that really it? And B, if it is, how did it get to be that way? So this, which those of you in the back can't see, is like a storyboard of how an asteroid like that might have come to pass. So 4.685 billion years ago, when the solar system was forming, when you have things bumping together because of gravity and then sticking together and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, when you have enough stuff that has enough radioactive isotope aluminum-26 in it, which decays, which makes heat, and then if you get hot enough, you will melt. And the heavy, dense stuff will sink to the middle because of gravity, and that's where all the metal and nickel and iron goes. And so we think, that's why the Earth has an iron core, by the way, kids sitting up front, and we think that Psyche got big enough to do that. It gets differentiated, we call it, but it didn't get so big that when it ran into other things, it stayed intact. We think it had a series of collisions that knocked all the outsides off, leaving behind just the metal insides. And then, as it started to cool, you get the outside metal freezing, and it starts to contract, and that like makes more things get concentrated inside, and stuff that has like sulfur concentrates in it might precipitate out and then float to the top. And then, as you keep shrinking, the metal cracks, and it releases the pressure, and you could get like sulfur volcanoes, which spew sulfur onto the surface. And we think, later on, something banged into it, which knocked it on its side, because it's not rotating like a top like the Earth does. It's like all the way over 90 degrees rolling around the solar system. It also has a magnetic field, like our iron core produces a magnetic, or we think it does. So these are, the like we don't know, but these are the kinds of things that the scientists are going to be looking for. So we are building a spacecraft called Psyche. It's like really creative. That's going to go visit the asteroid Psyche. I know, right? We're going to launch it in 2022. We're in the middle of building it right now. We're like making prototypes. Soon we're going to be doing testing. We have a huge critical design review coming up in April. I should like really be at home right now working on all that stuff. This is upside down. So, here's a person for scale, for those of you way in the back. And this spacecraft, it has the solar arrays folded up. When they're extended all the way out, the whole spacecraft is like the size of a single tennis ball court. It's pretty big. It weighs like 2,600 pounds, fully fueled, like kilograms. Ugh, metric. 2,600 kilograms fully fueled. And 1,000 kilograms of that is xenon. Because the thing that's cool about the spacecraft is it doesn't just use chemical propulsion where you mix something with oxygen that combusts and then makes pressure, which pushes things along. We use a xenon gas, which we fire electrons at, which knock little electrons off of the atoms that makes them positively charged. We run those through a huge magnetic field, which zings them out the back. And that's what we use to make the force to push the spacecraft along. And it's not very much force, right? If you hold a piece of bread in the palm of your hand, that's how much force these engines produce. But you have to keep them on week after week and month after month in order to get enough velocity to get the spacecraft out where it's going. So xenon ion engine, sending the spacecraft Psyche to go visit the asteroid Psyche. And we cannot wait to see what we're going to learn. That's it. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. Anybody? Anybody? You got to talk really fast. Yes. Almost always. So writers in the room, I love you all. Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, that is why I do the job that I do today. So I wanted to do a lot of things when I was a kid, but around high school is when I decided I wanted to go study engineering and do this kind of work.
As someone who uses xenon ion engines, are you critical of how space propulsion is portrayed in media?
Let me answer that question in this way. I love the way that The Expanse portrays space propulsion in media. So we'll answer that question that way. Yeah.
Psyche mission is very special for how much it supports artists.
Yes. Yes, I can. Oh my God. So our principal investigator, Lindy Elkin-Stanton, is the most wonderful person you will ever meet in your life. If I weren't married, I would want to have her love child, but I'm married. Sorry, Lindy. And she is very, very much about engaging the public and thinking about space exploration in a very creative way. And so there's this project called Psyche Inspired, where she gets undergraduate students in any kind of arena to come together and make artwork that reflects the stuff that we're doing on Psyche, like clay pots that have a surface that looks like Psyche, and cross-stitch of the asteroid, and just so many things. So look up Psyche Inspired and see what's out there. It's the best. Thank you for knowing about that. That's cool. I'm going to tell Lindy. That's awesome. Yes?
So when we talk about these things formed at the very beginning, where did they form from?
Oh, no, this is a long answer. Okay.
1 minute for questions.
Oh, I still have a minute. Do I have a minute? Okay, okay. This is gonna be, you're just gonna like this. Okay, so way back when the Big Bang happened, you made mostly hydrogen and some helium, and then you made your first generation of stars, which made fusion, and then they cooked up more and more and more heavier elements, and then they went supernova and spewed all that stuff all over the place. So you had these huge clouds of gas and dust, mostly hydrogen and helium, but some heavier stuff. And then when those clouds of dust and gas are out there, and other stars go supernova, they create a shock wave, which makes them start to contract, and then they come together mostly under electrostatic forces, because gravity doesn't work super well when you have these teeny tiny particles. Calcium, aluminum inclusions are the things that we can figure out how old the solar system is. So those things come together. As they start getting bigger, then gravity kicks in, and it starts getting bigger and bigger. And that's what, when you have enough mass in the middle, when you have enough hydrogen and helium, that kicks off the star and starts solar system going. But you have these clumps of other things that form around, all because of that. So that's the answer to that question. Wow. I might have time for another one. One more? Can I take one more?
Your time is up.
Oh, my time is up.
You have 3 minutes.
And can you believe it? She doesn't even drink caffeine. There's no caffeine.
Okay.
Clifford, you have 7 minutes.
Do we start? Oh, okay, great. Well, hi everyone. Given what Ahmed said, I think it's really nice that I get to talk about this because in some sense, what I'm talking about, which is essentially looking up in the sky and wondering, is one of the most, that's what this is for. Is one of the most profound things that we've done, and I think we've done it for as long as we are recognizable as the species that we are, and probably longer, right? Going back to our home in the cradle of the African continent, we've been looking up in the sky. After we've, figured out what we're going to eat, you sit there and you look up. What is that stuff, right? And we've learned so much about the universe over the from ancient times, where we moved maybe to other places on the planet. We still look up and we learn more and more and more. Now, of course, modern astronomy and astrophysics, that's still continuing our tradition of looking up, and hopefully you still look up. And we've learned so much about our universe, how vast it is, of course, how exciting it is, how violent it can be, how beautiful it can be, how diverse the different things are, right? Different kinds of planets, planets similar to Earth, planets completely different to Earth, stars similar to our sun, stars that are so different from the sun, and all kinds of other objects. But I think the most intriguing and perhaps mysterious object that I can think of, and I think most people might agree, is a black hole. We want to tell you a little bit about black holes. So first of all, yes, of course, we all have heard of black holes. They're part of our popular culture. You may not know they actually go back to at least as early as the 18th century. A school teacher, Mitchell, in England, came up with the idea and actually wrote, I think, to the Royal Society about it. And you can go back and read that paper. A French mathematician, Laplace, also around the same time had the idea. Who knows how many other people had a similar idea? Perhaps we were driven to it in some way. As we understood physics better and better, the idea becomes more and more less and less amorphous and begins to take shape. And of course, what happens in the early 20th century is that we have a good theory of gravity that can actually contain that idea. And that's Einstein's general relativity, which is still one of the most profound theories of our universe, experimentally verified in so many ways, tells us so much about how our universe works. If you look at the equations Einstein wrote down, the very first non-trivial solution that was written down actually contains a black hole. And it's so old as an idea, so ancient as a solution of the equations, and people pondered over it for many, many, many years, because of course, if it were true, if it were a true thing about our universe and not just an artifact of some equations, it would be incredibly profound, like nothing we've ever seen before. So people were understandably skeptical. And so it took some time. Of course, there weren't the observational techniques yet to understand whether the black holes were out there. So people were understanding it mathematically and physically, using physics and mathematics to try and understand it in sort of the abstract. If it were true, it would tell you something really amazing. It would be like the end of space-time, right? When you see that picture now that we have of a black hole, you probably all saw that in the news, right? For the first ever picture, you're looking at the end of space and time in that corner of that piece of the universe that picture is taken from. It's actually a neighboring galaxy. What do I mean by that, right? A black hole is an extreme gravitational situation. Right? Mitchell's original idea, which seems to be true, is that if you have enough mass, for example, from a star that died and ran out of fuel and begins to collapse under its own gravity, collapses under its own gravity, and if the star is massive enough, there's no force that we know of in the universe that will actually stop it from collapsing and collapsing and collapsing. That gravity gets stronger and stronger and stronger till you get to the point where nothing that we know of could escape from that object. So put it the other way, you're in the universe and you go in, or you send a messenger into that black hole, you go past the point of no return, it can never come back out to tell you what happened. So for all intents and purposes, that really is the end of space and time. There's nothing can come out of that and coherently tell you anything about what happened on the inside. So practically, that's what the end of the universe, the end of space and time looks like. Not the end of the universe, it's a different thing. But also, it also seems to be showing up in our actual physics. The laws of physics, the space and time as we know it, seems to come to an end in some sense that we're beginning to get grips with as you go into a black hole. So it's really quite a profound object. Now, you think of black holes as these destructive objects. Well, we all do. I do too, right? And in fact, in some sense, that's the first place you see them because of the products of their destruction. Stuff trying to fall in gets twisted and bent and atomized, and the atomized stuff gets atomized, and it turns into radiation, spews out, and then you see that because, of course, you don't see the black hole itself because it's black. So what actually happens is that you have these really destructive events in the neighborhood of a black hole. But there's more to black holes than destruction, I want to tell you today. I think they're quite beautiful objects. And I think there's another aspect of them that we should consider, that beauty.
Clifford, you have 1 minute.
For example, you have the fact that black holes, as far as we know, are in the core of nearly every galaxy in the universe. There's black holes, supermassive black holes, they're called, hundreds of millions of times the mass of our sun. Perhaps an object the size of our solar system in some cases, a single object in the core of a galaxy. But galaxies are the place where life as we know it actually emerges. And black holes are beginning to appear to be essential to those galaxies, not just incidental, but essential to how those galaxies work, possibly the seeds for those galaxies. So that's a wonderful thought, that black holes are not these destructive objects, but they also are the cradle of life. So you were maybe looking at the cradle of life when you were looking at that picture earlier this year. Black holes also do a wonderful dance when they encounter each other. That's something else we've been seeing recently with gravitational waves, ripples in space-time that they create as they move around each other and spiral in faster and faster and faster and faster, and then collide and merge and form a new black hole.
Clifford,
They
your
make
time
the
is up.
analog of a sound that's called a chirp, where it goes from low frequency to high frequency, and you hear a whoop sort of sound. And at the end of that, a new black hole is created. I think that's really beautiful. So there's so much to be said about the research in black holes that obviously I don't have time for. But the key thing I want to tell you is that we're understanding black holes at the quantum level. It's teaching us about space and time at the quantum level, telling us maybe about the origins of space and time, how it came to be, how it might end. And that is teaching us possibly about the origins of our entire universe, how that came to be. So black holes are really the key to so many things in physics. So hopefully you'll go away thinking now black holes are not just these scary monsters that are going to gobble everything up in some horrible way, but instead they're nuggets of creation, they're nuggets of opportunity, they're nuggets of wonder. So thanks for listening. Oh, you got it. Okay, to the next thing.
you. Bethany, you have 7 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Hi. Hello. Thank you. My name's Bethany Edwards. I am an oceanographer. And I think the first thing that people ask me whenever I say that is, do you study whales? Do you study coral reefs? And do you scuba dive? The answer is no to all 3 questions. I fell in love with the microbes of the ocean, the microbiology. I've spent a lot of my research career studying phytoplankton in the ocean. They are like plants of the ocean. They photosynthesize, taking up CO2 from the atmosphere and incorporating it into their biomass. Phytoplankton come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. They're things like cyanobacteria, which are really small. Some people have heard them called blue-green algae. But I'm more interested in the large phytoplankton, so things like diatoms, which take up minerals from the seawater to build glass frustrals that offer spikes and physical protection from things like grazers. I've had the pleasure of also studying the grazers of phytoplankton. So when I started graduate school, the canonical understanding was that phytoplankton are grazed by copepods. Copepods are shrimp-like organisms, plankton from SpongeBob SquarePants. He is a copepod. But it turns out that that's wrong. Phytoplankton, particularly diatoms, are actually grazed more by dinoflagellate grazers. And so these are single-celled organisms that engulf their prey. So they're not much bigger than the phytoplankton themselves, and they engulf them and then dissolve them in their food vacuoles. And so that was like a big paradigm shift whenever I was in graduate school, so I started studying that. I've also studied the viruses that infect phytoplankton and the bacteria that live around them, so the microbiome of phytoplankton like diatoms. And why do we care? Why do we care about phytoplankton? Well, I told you that they photosynthesize like a plant, right? And so this allows carbon to be sequestered or stored in the ocean. And so since the Industrial Revolution, about 40% of the CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere via fossil fuel burnings and deforestation has ended up in the ocean, in part due to phytoplankton photosynthesizing. Every second breath you breathe was made in the ocean. So phytoplankton also produce oxygen. And the oxygenation of our planet was done by ancient relatives of cyanobacteria. So when the Earth first formed, it had no oxygen, no free oxygen in the atmosphere at all. And we had an atmosphere very similar to Venus. And over time, as photosynthesis evolved, the atmosphere was oxygenated, right? So these tiny microscopic organisms have these big global scale impacts. It's a really beautiful story. What tools do I use to do this? So I told you I don't scuba dive. I work from a ship. I have scuba dived and I enjoy it, but I can't study these tiny little microbes, right? Like when I'm in there swimming with them, my skin cells are like the size of them, so I'm contaminating my samples. So we work from ship platforms. And we put instruments over the side to collect water from different depths. We also put sediment traps in the water. And these sediment traps almost act like funnels, and they catch the dead and dying phytoplankton that are coming from the surface ocean sinking down to depth, right? And that represents that carbon that's being stored in the ocean. And so we sample that and examine that. When I was in graduate school, it was this time of what I call the omics revolution, or the big data revolution. And so, as many of you know, sequencing DNA is dirt cheap these days. 23andMe, Ancestry.com, people can just afford it, right? And that's new. It used to be very expensive. People would get entire PhD just sequencing one organism. Now we can sort cells from a mixed sample and sequence them at will. And so that was a really big innovation in the microbial oceanography community, and we started sequencing DNA, and that would give us genomes, and so that's genomics. And that would tell us which microbes are there, and what genes do they have, and what is the chemistry that they're capable of doing. I've worked in that space. I've also looked at gene expression, so transcriptomics, but what my lab really does is lipidomics. And so lipidomics is the study of fats or lipids in environmental samples, or in lab samples too. But what we do is we look at the diversity of the lipids that are there, and we try to capture all of that diversity. And lipids are very diverse. And the reason that lipids are so structurally diverse is because they do a lot of different roles in cellular biology. So every single cell on the planet, from bacteria to your cells, has a membrane, and that membrane is made up of lipids. And that membrane serves as a physical barrier between the outside world and the inside of the cell, right? And that allows your cells to have some sort of homeostasis. And those lipids can be specific to different phytoplankton. And so we can use that as like a forensic signal for what phytoplankton are there. Lipids also are storage molecules. So butter, right, is made up of fats. And within each phytoplankton cell is a little lipid body that's filled with what is essentially butter. And they live off of that, right? That's their little like snack pack to keep them going. And phytoplankton also, well, all organisms also use lipids as chemical signals. So hormones, pheromones, those are all made from lipids. I'm really interested in a chemical signaling language called
Bethany, you
oxylitin.
have 1 minute.
And it's produced by phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, when they die, they start to produce these chemical signals that are made of lipids, and it deters other grazers. So the dinoflagellates hate these compounds. Whenever viruses infect them, diatoms, they'll start producing these compounds, and then they get out into the community, and they deter grazing, and they impact the microbiome. So the bacteria that live on the outside of diatoms, they get stimulated by these compounds. They're very tolerant. But the phytoplankton are producing these compounds, and let's say a bacteria that lives a free-living lifestyle, not on the surface of a diatom, they interact with these, and it kills them. So this chemical language is orchestrating this really beautiful dance between the microbial community in the ocean, and that has bigger biogeochemical impacts for the whole planet. And just the icing on the cake is that the same chemical language is being spoken in your bodies. Your immune system uses oxylitin whenever you get a wound or you battle a bacterial infection, and maybe that shouldn't be so surprising considering that life most likely evolved in the ocean.
Bethany, your time is
but
up.
It's a really beautiful story and something I hope that we can touch on later in the discussion panel. So.
guess we're going to start now. Good evening, everybody. My name is Philip Butler. I am the founder of the Seeker Project. Seeker is a distinctly black artificial intelligence with mental health capacities. And so Seeker is essentially a project that we are building to reframe what it means to be in conversation or be in relationship with a conversational artificial intelligence. We recognize that Siri and Alexa both hear tons of conversations, or at least a growing amount of conversations around people's mental health states, but we also recognize that Siri and Alexa are both incapable of handling these types of conversations. And so the intention here is that as we build this, its foundational component is around being able to handle these type of tough and even light conversations around people's mental health and internal states, because what we're trying to do is build a type of attachment and even relationality to these conversational artificial intelligence agents. The point of that is because the growing amount of way in which technology is inserted into our lives is not going to go away. It's only going to get more and more. And so as we try to customize and find ways to be more relatable, the idea is that we are deconstructing what it means to be an authority figure and a relayer of information, right? We recognize that both Siri and Alexa, we talked about before, are pretty much white women in a box. And so we have these racialized and gendered versions of what it means to be a delivery agent of information and even be an authoritative figure, right? Or someone who you are in constant conversation with. But in doing so, we still recognize that there's a need for cultural relevance, and even more so this ability to see oneself in a space that one is not normally in. And so the whole point of this really is to kind of, I said the idea of building attachment, but if you build attachment, then the idea is you build a friendship, and then you have the conversations that people really want to have. And so when nobody else is around, and we also recognize that loneliness is a growing kind of factor, epidemic around people who are millennial age and younger, the idea is that as people are around these
Your
agents,
7 minutes is officially starting.
Officially. Now, extra time. Right? And so as we see that loneliness is a real thing, and as people become more engaged with these agents, what we're attempting to do is kind of build this layer, right, of companionship. And so the name Seeker really is an assumptive name. It assumes that on some level, regardless of what anyone's belief system is, people are kind of seeking something, whether it be spiritual fulfillment, kind of identity, or just kind of a self-awareness. And so the idea is that as one is in conversation with these robots, that it can fulfill a space within individuals that give them the idea that they see themselves, that they're heard, and that they're able to kind of grow on this path that they have for life. Seeker itself is grounded in 3 particular psychotherapeutic or psychospiritual modalities: internal family systems therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and narrative psychology. Now, IFS, or internal family systems therapy, essentially is the idea that individuals ought to be able to accept themselves non-judgmentally, but at the same time have the capacity to be compassionate towards themselves. It's also grounded in the idea that individuals are more multiple than they are unitary, meaning that there's probably a part of me that really wants to be here and another part of me that really wants to be at home with my kids, right? And so this recognition, it suggests that there's like an internal tension kind of always going on, and the conversation between the multiple parts that I have should be one that is mitigated, or at least kind of navigated through the space of like acceptance, awareness, and compassion. Narrative psychology is really just the ability to kind of understand the stories that we tell ourselves and then reframe them, right? And so kind of what is the thing that you normally say about yourself? Is it really true? And then can you reframe it? What's a better way of kind of seeing this story about who you are? And then CBT, right, as we kind of know, is a more head-on approach. Like, what are you dealing with? How can we approach it? What kind of goals can we set? Are you meeting said goals, right? And so these become the foundational components of the Seeker framework, or interactive framework. And so it gives people the opportunity to oscillate between these 3 frameworks depending upon their openness, right, and willingness to engage upon these different frameworks. And then I think the idea is that essentially through these type of conversations, people have the capacity to build upon their own ideas of self-awareness and even kind of self-compassion. Nevertheless, beyond this idea is one in which allows people the ability to have themselves reflected in a way that gives Seeker the capacity to be grounded in experiences of Black people, right? So if when we started kind of narrowing down what we wanted Seeker to be able to do in terms or talk about, we initially wanted to be a Seeker to be like, Seeker should talk about everything, right? But in doing that and knowing the magnitude of what people could potentially say to this robot, we recognized that the robot really couldn't have more than 2 lines of conversation. So it was just like Siri and Alexa, like not good at this at all. And so what we did, we went back to the drawing board and we started going through like scenarios that are particular to black folks. Now I could show you this very same drawing board and you might even say, everybody goes through this, but the key component is experience. If we're grounding this in black experiences, then what are the ways that black people deal with police brutality? What are the ways that black people deal with sexual trauma? What are the ways in which black people deal with other forms of trauma overall that gives no, it's fine. Let's all dance. Yeah, right? I appreciate it, man. I'm feeling Tony Stark, like kind of Tony Starkish right now, like, right? And so the idea is that we're being very particular about the ways in which we frame these experiences, because if our target is to be able to help black people deal with what they're going through, then we need to be able to orient these conversations around in which black people understand themselves. And so one of the things that we're doing that we think is pretty interesting is that we are being clinically sound without being clinically sounding, right? Because given the stigma of mental health within the community, the idea is that we are utilizing these frameworks that are time-tested and have a set of data around them, but we want to do so in a way that people really can't pick up. They're actually having a kind of almost a therapeutic conversation, right? So it's pretty much kind of like a barbershop conversation, right? That's grounded in this kind of wisdom. And so when we set up these conversations this way, it fundamentally shifts the way in which we understand what is an artificial agent, what is artificial about said agent, and what about this agent can actually be more than just a sounding board. Because you could think of Seeker in a few ways. Seeker is essentially a container for black history, a container for critical black consciousness, and a sounding board for critical internal discourse. Because the idea is that if people are seeking something, then the way in which they do that has to be through an engagement, deconstruction, and reevaluation of the way in which they understand themselves and the world around them. And so Seeker's helping to facilitate these conversations. And once we are able to do this, then really the future of it is unbounded, right? Because you can easily add skill sets. Seeker, can you help my son with his homework? Sure. What's he working on, right? Seeker, can you help me with his email, right? You are going to come up with the contents of the email, right? Because Seeker itself isn't going to write it. If it's a black AI, it's going to say some things that is not going to be just you can dictate this to me, because this robot is not a slave, right? And so we got to be very clear about the ways in which this robot understands itself and then reiterates itself against other folks. And so when we talk about adding these skill sets, that can be the easier part. But what we're really focused on now is the way in which we understand Seeker's capacity to do this. Because once we do this, once we get this down pat, then I think we have to force the bigger dogs in the fight to actually reformulate or come and license our technology because their robots can't talk like ours. So just off the hands, 1, 2.
Yeah, that was actually my question about how you intend to roll it out once it is ready for the market. Do you intend to do your own devices or like roll it out on Android? Like, what's the thinking?
That's a good question, man. No, I think because there are solid devices out there, and so I think maybe the good way is to integrate into other people's. Because I mean, given the way smartwatches are, if we're going to utilize biometrics to be able to tell people you're stressed, what's going on, or like what's the weather patterns, do we need to have a conversation around whatever's happening, then we can already be integrated within that without actually having to go through the testing of hardware, which would allow us to eventually get there. And so I think we can do this incrementally, but essentially at the very least it gives us the capacity to have a foundation on other people's platforms.
Your time is up. Philip, thank you so much. You can make yourself comfortable there on stage. Everyone else is going to join us in this room, so hang tight. And then we'll have moderated discussion with Ahmed Best and time for Q&A.
I could, but I don't really.
Hey guys, someone left a cell phone in one of the executive conference rooms. It's got a home screen with a wave on it. Anybody? All right.
It doesn't, because all right. 1, 2. Yeah. See what we can do.
Just please be careful, because this is a cable.
1, 2. Before we get started, somebody left a cell phone. That's Lonnie's. Good thing we're friends. Could have brought it to your house. Yeah, please come in and sit down and get started, because we heard a lot in each 7-minute program, and I don't know about y'all, but I was mind blown. There was several mind blowing situations that happened this evening, and I definitely want to continue the blowing of minds with everyone here now that you're all in one room, and we can go Ultra Instinct in here now. I really love this idea about being a part of the ocean, Bethany. And I was really digging what you were talking about the phytoplankton and the lipids, and how our immune system kind of mirrors what goes on in the microbiology of the ocean. Mm-hmm. And I would love for you to kind of expand on this idea of why we are the environment and not in the environment, and how we could take the lessons from the phytoplankton into our own bodies.
Right. Yeah, and I think what you said, like, we are of the environment instead of being in the environment. Is that the way?
Yeah, we are the environment rather than being in the environment.
Right, and that's a modern concept, right? That, like, humans are set aside, somehow we're not animals, we're above that. And yeah, we have maybe, higher social or orders and musicality, and there's all of these ranges of things that set us apart, right? But if you think about it evolutionarily, all life originated somewhere. And there's two theories out there that it originated either in a really hot, shallow pond, thermal vent, or like thermal hydrothermal system on the surface, on land, or in the ocean. And I would argue that it probably occurred in the ocean, deep in the ocean. And so, we all have the same origin, and I think, it shouldn't be surprising that the same chemical language is still around, right? Humans, we evolved something like, I don't know, 4 million years ago, like hominids, like diverged from the chimp line. But these organisms evolved at like 2.5 billion years ago, the phytoplankton. So, you know, they've been around a lot longer, right? And so the DNA, we share that with all living organisms on our planet. RNA, lipids, we share all that, so it makes sense that we'd share the same chemical language, right?
What lesson can we take from the microbiomes in the ocean for us? Like, is there something that we can learn from that should be able to influence the way we live every day?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that it's cyclical, that phytoplankton bloom, they die, they get recycled, and they're, you know, allow rebirth and new blooms to form, you know, and so we can kind of sit and ease, I think, in some ways, especially if you're like sitting around stressing about, you know, what's tomorrow to bring, just by, you know, hearkening back to that. So I don't know if that's a very good answer. I don't get chances to talk to people who are not scientists very often. So these are some very like social construct questions. I'm like,
yeah, I mean,
I'm not qualified to talk about this.
What I was getting from a lot of the talks today is, you know, how we can look at the macro and the micro and place it into our everyday thinking and how we approach each other as well as how we approach these topics. And I was very interested because we have 3 people who are talking about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is becoming so ubiquitous in our everyday that biointelligence folded into artificial intelligence is like, what is that? What are we going to be? How do we integrate that? And while I was thinking about that, I was thinking about artificial intelligence and ethics, right? Because that's not something that we talk about very much when we talk about artificial intelligence. And Maynard, when you were talking about governments and you were talking about borders and information and education, what are the ethics being discussed when we talk about artificial intelligence? Especially when we're talking about race and gender.
Did you have your lapel mark?
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh.
you're right there. You spare no expense here.
Yeah.
Science
All right.
Day.
All right.
That's the micro.
Yeah, thanks for dropping that science on me. So great question, and you know, one that I'm you know, acutely attuned to, you know, because of the populations that it affects. And so when I was in the Obama administration, that is one of the things that you know, we focused on was this disparate impact of AI on communities of color. And then, as I said in my talk, you know, that all of you heard, was now it's deployed at our borders and at international borders to determine people's eligibility, you know, for asylum and to, you know, enter, you know, countries and change their lives. And so that's a very big question. You know, the city of New York, you know, created a commission around algorithmic bias to study it in its use in city systems and how you know, it affects those populations. And what we're seeing now is a push back for, you know, people wanting to have explainability and redress and know that, you know, the AI they're dealing with is free from bias, and we're not there yet, because, you know, we see examples in the wild of AI, you know, exhibiting the same biases that are, you know, in our society. So, you know, it's a very big question, and you know, it's going to take all of you to you know, help advocate for, you know, fairness and accountability and transparency, and as I said in my talk, consent and all those things.
And Philip, with that, how do you digitize the Black experience to go against artificial intelligence bias?
Why'd you do this, man?
Simple question, sorry.
So, I'm actually for biased AI. And here's why I say this. AI needs to be rebiased. If we're talking about we're at the cusp, right, of an entirely different way of existence, then AI, if AI is going to be at the center of this in some ways, then we need to be thinking about disruptive ways of modes of existence. So as somebody who is essentially kind of thinking about these ideas as well, we can't necessarily place AI in a frame. You can't give AI the opportunity to allow itself to run and then ask for it to now make better decisions. We're essentially codifying current modes of stratification if we just let that happen. And so if we intentionally rebias AI for what the world that we actually want, then maybe we'll get a different existence. And so kind of thinking along these lines, we talk about utilizing AI, the black experiences, right? There's no Black experience, right? Using AI and Black experiences to combat this bias. We rebias AI, but at the same time, we create counter-tech. I think counter-tech is one of the most kind of important modes of technology going into the rest of the 21st century, right? If we don't create counter-tech to undo some of these biases, given that governing structures and kind of the big players in this realm are not necessarily going to be the progenitors of this kind of rebiased, disruptive AI, then it needs to be kind of done from the ground up from other people.
And could gaming be the way into this counter-tag?
No, I definitely think so. So I've never got to this point in my talk, right, that thinking about the future of labor, we recognize that kind of in this data is labor movement, one of the things that we actually are doing with this Seeker project is we are being intentional about user data, the ownership of said data, especially around Black data, but also attempting to create a sub-economy through this thing. And so thinking about the ways in which people participate. So participation in some ways gives people the opportunity to have ownership of not necessarily the company as a whole, but at least the data that they are contributing to said company. And so this becomes another counter-tech. If we are now leveraging Black data that comes out of Black experiences, then in some ways we can kind of have a collective way of bargaining with these larger companies. Now, if the Seeker project gets to have a large say in what happens with Black data, we can have a conversation with Facebook and Google about the utilization of Black data or the stoppage thereof, because Black people now own the said data for themselves.
And Lonny, when you developed algorithms from the future, of which I helped develop, thank you.
Yes.
We were talking about creating this empathic way of the Black experience and those Black experiences being shared with groups of people. Can you talk about how that could influence artificial intelligence and influence just thinking in general when we're talking about Black experiences into the future?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the idea of how they're training artificial intelligence is through games, teaching them through machine learning, right? They're playing Go and other types of games like that. So if we teach artificial intelligence with games that help democratize the future, equitable games, games that speak about liberation, then we have a chance to infuse more African soul and what I call queer soul as well into artificial intelligence. So what we need is a queer AI, an Afro-queer AI, and that's what I'm rooting for. Also, we're working with Blue Cross Blue Shield and the Institute for the Future in creating what we're calling a California Equitable Futures Network, where we're going to train community activists to train their communities into articulating their own visions of the future, using these games and to convene a conference. Imagine a conference where communities are displaying their own visions of the future that can translate into legislative action, community projects, and building cathedrals of the future for themselves. And I think that's what we really need, is to have everybody in on this. We need all hands on deck, to deal with our climate emergency and a president in the Twilight Zone. Okay? So
Amen on that.
Yeah.
So I want to go to space. No, I want to go to space. Like, I want to get in a rocket and go to space. But before I do that, how, when you get to Psyche, right? Say you all right, you get on Psyche and you go to Psyche. Right? So when you get to Psyche, what are you gonna do? Like, what happens on? What's gonna happen?
Are you talking about when we send our spacecraft there? Or
Yeah.
So,
Like you with the xenon ion
Nice,
landing, you took Psyche. Now you're Psyche squared. What happens?
Nice. So we're going to spend all of our time orbiting Psyche from a pretty high altitude and trying to use our science instruments to take a bunch of data to confirm or not confirm, like real facts, everybody, what the asteroid is actually like. And it's interesting because some people who aren't thinking about, well, science for the sake of science, like, well, why? Why are you going? Who cares? Why are you spending all this money doing it? And there's a two-fold answer to that. There's one, when you learn more about the world and what is actually true about the world, you can be super excited because it's things that you might not ever have imagined. We can inspire the younger generation, even if they grow up to be doctors or lawyers or something else that's not space. It really gives you a drive to go out and do something in the world. And so people will say, well, are you going to do something that's going to change something about my life right now, today? Well, no. But it might change something about the future 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, when we go out and prove what these asteroids are made of. Maybe there will be asteroid mining and civilization is going to expand across the solar system. See what I did there? Expanse is awesome.
Boom. Shout out to the Expanse. Shout out to sci-fi. I have a personal stake in sci-fi as well. Is the eventuality mining these asteroids and trying to get some of this material back to Earth? Is that in kind of the cards for this?
So, me, engineer, not economist or politician. So I think speculatively, that is a possible thing. This is the opinion of Tracy Drain and not the opinion of NASA. That when you take a far enough view, that kind of thing to me seems like it's in the cards. When you're looking very near term, it's hard for me personally to see how you make that economically viable because it's so difficult to get spacecraft out there and so difficult to get things back. But you have to baby step your way into the future, and if you don't take that first little step, you'll never get all the way.
So, Clifford, when gravitational waves is a very recent discovery, isn't it? It was within the past year, right? Or a couple years?
2.5.
So what did it teach us about black holes that we didn't already know?
That's a great question. One of the first things was that, so is this live? Is this working? Yes. Okay. Yeah. One of the first things, I think, was that when they unraveled the signals of this dance, as I talked about these two black holes that were merging, they realized that they could compute the masses of those individual black holes. Wow. And it was in a range that we'd never seen black holes before. We weren't even sure such black holes existed. And when I say we, I mean the large community of
You mean
people.
like me and you?
Not me especially, the community. And so that was a surprise right at the outset. It was, you can sit down and think about black holes and where they might be, and something about their simplicity, and they turn out to be very simple objects, is that you can have them at any mass, theoretically. You could have black holes that are microscopic, size of an atom or smaller. You could have black holes that are hundreds of millions of times the mass of the sun. But the point is, what can the universe actually make? What are the mechanisms for making a black hole? And so people were actually thinking about mechanisms by which you might make black holes that, say, are what we think of as stellar-sized black holes versus supermassive black holes. The discovery of the gravitational waves, wave emitters in those collisions was that the black holes were in a range that people had not thought of a mechanism for how they might come about before. So that was already a surprise. We sort of filled in a part of the spectrum of sizes of black holes that people had speculated about. But then it's beginning to open up all sorts of remarkable possibilities because you learn about the details of the collision process, for example. So that's probably what's going to happen next. There's new data coming in. We're able to detect those things. Again, we, the larger scientific community. I don't work on these things directly myself. There are more and more of these events, so you can now learn more and more about what these collisions are like. I am particularly interested in, for example, what happens at the moment those black holes merge. You have two separate black holes merging to form one black hole. That's a profound moment where two become one in some ways. There may be hints in there about what's going on with the black hole horizons, which is where people who, myself, will worry about quantum physics are very interested. So we haven't learned anything new yet, but we may be on the cusp of learning something very new about that area. And so there's some remarkable opportunity there. And there are lots of other things that people are excited about. Once you know you have a new massive object that's of a certain mass, and you just saw one event, it tells you that there must be many, many more of those events all around the universe. So suddenly you have a new massive object of a certain size you didn't know about before. What's its effect on the whole universe? What's it doing? So people began to immediately think, well, maybe these could be a component of dark matter. Maybe they could be a component of the evolution of certain kinds of stellar populations. So all kinds of new thoughts were had because you found that one number that said these things were several times larger than we thought they would be.
Wow. Did anybody else get chills when he said when two black holes become one? That almost gave me the same chills as when Maynard said the Obama administration. Oh, those were good days. I want to open the floor up to questions from the audience, and you can ask your question, and I'll repeat the question for broadcast purposes. But I want to give you guys a chance to talk to these people as well, because I shouldn't be the only one having fun. Yes. Just say it. I'll repeat it.
Yeah, so this is directed towards Maynard. For ethical concerns of AI, we see a lot in terms of data bias on how it can be biased towards input and maybe how we even gather data in the first place.
Right.
So in regards to applications towards asylum and maybe in self-driving cars, at what point do we allow, or at what point do we allow for XYZ biases to be in the system to be applied towards more important things? So for example, to what standard are we holding AI in order for us to give the okay to use it for asylum, determining self-driving safety?
So what are the determining factors of AI, and when do we let AI take over or give over to AI?
But in particular to data bias.
Specifically to data bias.
Yeah, so that's a testing issue that is still, it's a moving target, so it's a continuum right now. And so there's a lot of debate around what bias, as you just said, that we allow in, because some bias is good, from just a safety standpoint, and others obviously is not good. So what I'd say is it's TBD at this point. And one of the things that we're looking at is what testing regimes do you need to verify things, and and as Lonny said earlier, we need to have communities come together and be at the table when these systems are being created. And as a Supreme Court justice said when they asked him, well, what's pornography? And he's like, I'll know it when I see it. Same with bias. The communities represented in this room, we know when things are biased against us, and so we've got to be at the table to make that determination.
Thank you. Good question. Yes, right over here.
I have a question for Philip. Can you talk about how you developed Seeker as genderless, and particularly the way that genderlessness has informed your understanding of a critical Black consciousness?
So how is Seeker developed genderlessness, and how is that in correlation with critical Black consciousness?
Right. So I think part of the idea of this kind of genderlessness has to do with the ways in which it orients itself, right, in terms of fluidity, right? And so within this space, depending upon the user and what the user says, the reflection of the reflection that Seeker provides becomes one that is distinct to the user. And so its genderlessness almost becomes inflections of genderedness, depending upon the ways in which one shows themselves to the bot. And so it allows for this kind of critical space to arise, because when one shows oneself as gendered, then Seeker begins to reflect that, but also becomes critical of the ways in which one shows up in a gendered fashion. And so if one is purporting to engage in a level of misogyny or so on and so forth, then the Seeker can also theoretically be able to one to raise the questions of where these ideas come from, how is this generative to the people that you're in contact with or in relationship with, and what are the ways that we can begin to reformulate our understandings of what it means to exist as a gendered being who is the one on the other side of the robot, and become more generative in the ways in which one leaves this conversation and then functions back in the world around them. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm going to go here and then there. Here first.
So my question is for Tracy. There's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence this evening, but we have a lot of robots exploring the solar system. To what extent are they actually artificially intelligent, or are they just being programmed from Earth?
So to what extent are the artificial intelligence artificially intelligent, or are they programmed from Earth?
Right, and so one of the assumptions people might make when you think of NASA, you think of space exploration, you're thinking, well, it must be on the absolute cutting edge of software development. But the thing that a lot of people might not be aware of is we also need to have things that are very well tested, very well proven. We know it's going to work, and so we're not on the bleeding edge of software when we develop the spacecraft that we're sending out to do these missions. So they're largely pre-programmed from Earth. They do have a lot of smarts because some of them are way far away. It might take half an hour, 15 minutes for a signal to get there, and then the same amount of time to get back, so we can't joystick the little suckers. They have to have enough smarts where if something goes wrong, they have some steps to take in order to keep themselves safe. But if you compare that to what I think of, not an AI expert, as artificial intelligence, it's really not there. We are trying to figure out ways to let them have more autonomy and let them be more non-deterministic because it can be more efficient. For some of us more old school engineers, that's really scary because it's harder to test them very well and to know exactly what they're going to do. And so that is a paradigm shift that I'm sure we will be making and getting more comfortable with so that they can be able to do more things. We can give them a science goal, go take data of interesting things and then sit back and watch it happen, which makes my skin crawl. but eventually, that'll be a good direction for us to go in. So not there yet, but interesting things might be on the horizon.
Right back there in the plan.
It's a question that attempts to collide the back holes of Bethany's work in the microorganisms and the work of all of the various thinkers on artificial intelligence here, which is my special interest. And exactly how to phrase it is tricky, but maybe I'll go with this. Bethany, do you consider that these microorganisms that you know so well are in some sense intelligent? And if so, if they embody some form of intelligence, is there anything that our artificial intelligence thinkers can use in their work to sort of re-understand intelligence? For example, if our own intelligence had grown from such basic origins to where we are in a different way, perhaps it would have looked different in terms of race and queerness and so on. Like, might we start differently with very basic intelligence of the kind that you study? If so, how? Discuss, everybody.
So to rephrase, just for YouTube, because that was a really good question. Is there an intelligence in the microorganisms that you study, and how is that, or can that inform artificial intelligence in the future? Go answer the question.
So I think most microbiologists, we try not to anthropomorphize our subjects, and the idea of altruism and that kind of stuff will get us in trouble just with our colleagues. But when I see like this process going on of these phytoplankton, being on their deathbeds and sending out this signal, and it stimulates the bacteria that live on them, and then that regenerates nutrients, which will fuel future blooms of phytoplankton, potentially helping their kin. That to me, they're doing this on purpose, right? But it's really this chemical signaling that's worked out through evolution, like the time of trying and testing things out, right? is what we tell ourselves, right? That's the story that we construct, that there's no maker, there's no creator, there's no set plan. It's just the clockwork, and that's what happened, right? So I think, like, as a classically trained microbiologist, that's the answer, right? Is that, no. But when I see this play out, I do think that there is altruism in the system, and I think that as evolution progresses, the things that are successful and that continue to propagate and continue to be that are extant species, existing species now, right, are things that do have some of these attributes of what I would call altruism, that the self-sacrifice for the greater good, or this communication on a larger, broader scale with all the organisms around them. There's evolutionary pressure to select for that. And so I do think that that's something that's, preserved and passed on, right? And then as we think about artificial intelligence, I'm not entirely, I'll let you guys pick up on that. How do you think that microbes can inform, things that we're trying to do?
Well, I mean, there is that theory of social contagion. If you're around people that are happier, you tend to be happy. If you're around people that are sadder, you tend to be sadder. And so this theory of social contagion, I think, kind of ties into this idea of altruism, too, where we can create, and we're getting better at creating social vibes that scale up quickly. And we see, when we saw the internet, we at first imagined more altruism happening, but we're also seeing the undertow of it, and the trolls too that occur as well. But I think altruism ultimately wins out, right? So collective at scale. Kevin Kelly talks about this too, from former editor of Wired magazine, where he talks about right now the Earth is a combination of, animal life, fauna, and artificial machines, technology, and humans. And if you look at it, the intelligence is at the scale of a mushroom. But maybe collectively we're going to be a more super intelligence combined.
Like my mom always said, if you got 9 broke friends, you will be the 10th. Social contagion. Social contagion. Our host, Victoria.
So, Bethany, to tap into the microbiome of the ocean and related to us, what you were mentioning, circle back to that. How do you respond to the plankton eating microplastics and also all the noise pollution? How does it affect our microbiome?
How does the ocean eating all this junk affect our microbiome? The microplastics in the ocean.
Yeah, I think, so studying natural systems is really complicated in the current era, which is the only era that I guess you could have done this type of work, because the signals are mismatched, right? We have the natural oscillation of the system, and then we have all of this human forcing. And so it's really hard to tease these things apart. So I'll start by saying that. And then with the microplastic thing, I think what's fascinating is that now we're sequencing genes of microbes that are growing on microplastics that are floating around in the North Pacific Gyre. And we see that, oh my God, they have genes to break down plastics and hydrocarbons. Who knew? And so I think that nature continues to surprise us, right? And so when we think about the evolution of our own microbiomes, I don't have any faith that like our microbiome's gonna shift to being able to, thrive on a diet of McDonald's and Diet Coke. But I think that our microbiomes will surprise us. And the more I don't work in this space, but when we see like fecal transplants and things like that, helping children who are born without the right microbiome to do the thing they need to do, or we look at data that shows that people who are born via cesarean have a higher chance of getting depression because they don't have the right microbiome, we really do have to step back and think about this micro to macro, right? That the microorganisms that are part of our body too play an integral role in how we go about our daily life, and the microbes that live in the ocean play an integral role in how our planet is the way it is today because of those microbes.
Great, right here.
I have a question. I think it's maybe for Clifford, Tracy, somewhere in there, a space question. I've been lucky a couple of times to work on projects with one of the smartest people I've ever met, named Story Musgrave, who's a retired astronaut and a medical doctor and a writer and all these crazy things. And he said something once that sort of distilled something I've wondered about many times, and he kind of distilled it down to some question. And I wondered if I throw this out to you, if anything in your research would support this theory. And he said that he thought there were two frontiers left that we know the least about. And one is space, and the other is death. And that he thinks they're connected.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
I'm not going to sleep tonight.
So I'm pointing my finger at Clifford because I'm an engineer and not a scientist. I'm like, ooh, punt.
So the question was, the question was, space and death are the two frontiers that we are still exploring. Space and death are the two frontiers that are uncharted, and are they possibly connected? And we all shudder.
So I mean, engineer, not scientist. This is speculation, having thought about this question for all of 12 and a half seconds. So, I mean, as a person not of faith, right, to me, death is just the absence of existence. Before you were born, you were not there. It's a huge eternity of nothingness for you. You're born, you have this crack of light and all this marvelous stuff you get to explore. You die, huge eternity of nothingness. And so, I mean, not to be a downer. The crack of light is wonderful.
Tracy.
I'm also a very positive person. And I think that, you know, it's interesting that you can sort of see a parallel when it comes to space. You think of space as being mostly empty, but it's scattered with these super brilliant stars that illuminate the world around them and give us all this really beautiful stuff to go explore. So I can see them as being connected in that way. I wonder if that's how Story was thinking about it, or if he's thinking of something else.
Your turn.
Now I see the arc of what you did there. That was so good. That was so good. I'm not gonna even. That's great. That's great. I have nothing to add. That's brilliant.
Question back there.
Thank you so much for each of your presentations. I really appreciate it.
Set the timer.
So, if we think about California's unique form of anti-blackness and how it relates to black children and how they, on just about every indicator from college dropout rates to academic performance in a number of subjects, they are faring the absolute worst. But if you connect with the average black child in South LA, they are incredibly brilliant. They could be the next Lonny, you know, they could be the next Maynard. Creative like no other, you know, group I've seen, and I'm a professor. But you don't get to, they don't get to live out their full potential in the classroom. How can your work fill the ways that you are drawing on Afrofuturism? How can your games, your projects sort of help kids to somehow tap into
So the question is, how can anyone's work up here on the stage find itself into a classroom where black children who are mostly adversely affected by society and don't get to live up to their full potential? How can your work reach them so they may live to their full potential? Simple question.
So right now, we're actually we put together a proposal for LA County's Department of Mental Health to be their initiative for next year. So whether or not they pick us up is one thing, but part of the goal is AI has the capacity to actually make mental health access, a thing, like legitimately, right? It severely cuts the cost, where LA County that can't afford to even put a school psychologist in every school, and so the access component becomes something that I think is a very integral piece. And so if we get this opportunity, I think one of the things we'll be able to do is again kind of provide this kind of digital companionship, for the black community, because it's actually the subgroup that we're working on is the African American community, African American community. And so I think the idea is that I think part of what you're hinting at is just the stressors come from outside of the classroom that these students are unable to kind of sift through, right? And so the hope is that this robot can hold space for them, right? And in doing so, it can allow, because I think holding space is something that becomes like kind of underutilized and even kind of undervalued. And so if something as simple as the Seeker Project can actually hold space for these children, right, then potentially that it can release some of the burden, give them the chance to see themselves for who they are, and then give them give them the opportunity, right, to kind of move beyond some of these spaces. Now we recognize that and it's not going to be able to answer everything, because I think there are some legitimate kind of like financial needs that some folks have to deal with, kind of bypass and just kind of and other kind of socioeconomic issues that are still hurdles. But I think at the very least, this kind of mental health place where as Seeker can become kind of not just a container, but just a reflector, right, a sounding board where somebody's having an ideation that is kind of indicative of depression, right, or one that is one of loneliness or suicidal ideation that is not necessarily something that requires the help of a professional at this moment. Then I think the robot should be able to have the capacity to help them do that.
That's excellent. The stresses are from inside the classroom as well, with teachers who aren't trained to recognize them in their full humanity, and from like materials that like don't center their experiences. So yeah, thank you.
I think I can. I would love to throw in an answer. I know I didn't do a 7-minute talk, but doing a bunch of these and talking to wonderful intellects like this, and having the Afrofuturist podcast, which you should all download and subscribe to on iTunes. The Afrofuturist podcast, new episode out midnight tonight. But I think what we have to recognize, especially when we're talking about young black children, of which I was one and I have one, is that we have to, as the adults, as the society, as the tribe, as the council of elders, we have to let them know that is their right to be able to imagine what their future is and will be. It's not a privilege. It's not something that can be bestowed or given to them. It is their right. And if we solidify that, if we ground them in that right, then they have nothing but to excel and soar.
Yeah, so if I can add to that. So I'm going to say the magic word again. When I was in the Obama administration.
Yes, it feels so good. Oh, it feels so good.
Say it again.
So that's one of the things that got me in touch with the National Academies was their foundational belief in changing the narrative. And so I represented the Department of Defense for STEM diversity and inclusion issues at the interagency level. And so I was at the White House when I met, the exchange, but they were convening around bringing scientists and engineers of color, from around the government to show Hollywood that we existed. And I think back to my own trajectory, and as I've said to people in conversation tonight, it was fictional for me. My motivators were fictional because I didn't see anybody that looked like me, and so I had to look to Star Trek to see Dr. Richard Daystrom from The Ultimate Computer as a role model. And then it wasn't until the shuttle astronaut class came out, that was women and Hispanics and African Americans, that you finally saw somebody real. But we have to be, as the president said, be the future that we want to create. And we need to, up here, digitize ourselves so that we can be in these classrooms and in front of these students so they see a reflection. So I, volunteer teach robotics, up in Oakland and around the Bay Area. But, the need is greater than anything I can, fulfill. But with these technologies like, what Philip was talking about, we need to be able to present those reflections so the kids can say, and we can say to them, I did it, you can too.
I got time for one more question. Let's go right there. You had your hand up a few times.
Thanks. Thank you guys very much for these really impressive talks. I have a question that's primarily directed at you, Philip, but it's an AI question. What do you think are the risks and the responsibilities, and basically the discussion that we need to be having about AI that kind of takes over some or all the role of therapists? Because I think that it may even be, I guess, what you were talking about, Maynard, like a high risk sort of responsibility for an AI, and what are we doing to regulate it, and how are we getting ahead of that?
So the question is, as AI takes over the role of therapy, what are the risks and what do we need to look out for when we do start relying on AI for our psychotherapy needs?
No, I think that's an excellent question. It's a timely one, right? Because I think initially you're dealing with issues of like HIPAA, right? And so you have privacy issues kind of at the forefront. But then we have ones of safety, right, and even responsibility. And so I think one of the key things, I think in every talk I've said something about the idea that we want this to kind of be like a Siri Alexa in every house and every phone, right, in every space that it will allow it. But I think even more so that I didn't necessarily get to speak about was the reality that we want to build this into infrastructures that already exist. And so if something goes beyond kind of seeker's pay grade, then it should the idea is that it should be able to reach out to people who are going to be kind of on call, or at the very least can respond in kind and immediately, right? And so it's not necessarily, seeker's not ever intended to replace the therapist, but it becomes a medium in between, right? So we talk about the stigma within the community around mental health or seeking help. This becomes almost a pre-therapist kind of conversation, right? So it gets people to warm up to the idea of actually having this kind of conversation, making that normative, and then when folks are ready, they can actually kind of have a list of local therapists that they can reach out to simultaneously in between sessions. If somebody's already seeing someone, your therapist provided these kind of exercises. Have you done them yet this week, right? In between sessions, and so it kind of have these kind of frameworks. Also, we want to build it into dispatch, right? And so, like, if something happens that requires actual emergency assistance, if somebody says something, will trigger its kind of emergency response system and connect it directly to people who can be readily available. And so, it's not something that we're trying to take on this responsibility from folks. Again, we talk about the team of clinicians that we're trying to that are kind of on our board and helping us make sure that we're clinically sound. And so it's a matter of kind of building an ecosystem that allows for this structure to function responsibly, because we recognize that lives are at stake. That's kind of the whole point, you know what I mean? And so the idea is that we take these precautions preemptively because we don't want to have to deal with the repercussions afterwards.
Well done. All right, go quick. Go.
Following up on that, though, like if you're talking about it as a first filter, like a first line of defense that then refers, then we kind of run into like some good Samaritan issues, like where if the impression is that it is already under this like rescue operation and it's obligated to complete that rescue operation, people, is there a risk that AIs making that decision or not will prevent people from becoming that first filter in the future?
So the question is there a risk that that first prevention method step would filter in between the psychotherapy that is necessary, in between psychotherapy that's necessary and possibly the AI determining whether psychotherapy is necessary?
Yeah.
So I'll let you know the secret. You ready? Like AI really isn't that non-determinate in its ability. Like we have to build this thing out like on purpose. And so most of the frameworks that we're doing are going to have like certain steps. So if the conversation reaches a certain level, then it's already kind of like a fail-safe. This needs to be escalated. And even beyond, so even if it's even in the point where it's just kind of pre-therapist, right? The onus and still in some ways it becomes on the user. And if the user indicates that they want to have access to some local therapist, or my friend was speaking to this one, can you get me their number? The seeker is not going to get in the way from that. That's kind of that's part of the intentionality of kind of building this framework. It's meant to be a conduit between people this way. It's meant to kind of again be this buffer initially, but be the conduit eventually. And so I don't think we really want to ever step in between, the potential for connecting people with others.
All right. Well, this has been a dream come true for me. When I first started the Afrofuturist podcast with Lonny, when he and I first got on that 2-hour conversation and we decided to do this thing, I never would imagine I'd be dating all of you. And you guys have really made this not only a podcast worth doing, but something that was worthwhile and filled a really, really wonderful spot in my heart. I can't thank you all enough for being here. I would love to shout out the Fathomers, Stacy, Annie, and Lacey. I'd like to thank Rick at the Exchange for allowing us to curate this evening. You guys are such a wonderful organization, and I hope you don't mind me camping out in your office because I'll be there tomorrow. I would love to thank everybody up on this stage: Lonny Brooks, Clifford Johnson, Bethany Edwards, Philip Butler, Tracy Drain, and Maynard Holliday for blowing our minds. Please stick with the Exchange. Hopefully we'll be able to do this again. The Afrofuturist podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get podcasts. Afrofuturist podcast. If you have an honest good podcast, please download it. Please follow it. Thank you all for being here. Shout out to LinkedIn. If I didn't answer that LinkedIn message from Stacy, I wouldn't even be out here. So everybody, answer your LinkedIn messages. Good night.